Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Best on Wellbeing podcast. My name is Guillaume Tremblay, and today we're going to talk about being triggered. Everybody knows what that is, and we've all experienced it when something happens, whether it's a comment from somebody or a new bank statement, something that comes out of nowhere or perhaps unexpected that suddenly sends us into a triggered state, a loop of lots of negative emotions. And I thought today we would look at the mechanics of it in order to understand a little bit how we can move out of it more efficiently, not magically. Sometimes when we have these states and we try to apply certain techniques like breathing techniques, which is what we're going to talk about today, we expect this sort of instant, like, well, it's not working because I still feel like crap. But that's not the point. The point is to be more effective at it, to improve in terms of how much faster can we move out of this triggered state. So other words we can use for it is like when we're in a mode of catastrophic thinking, when our mind is moving so fast and we're exaggerating everything and everything's the end of the world. So we've all experienced these types of triggered states, if you will. The spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle calls it sort of the pain body, when the pain body gets sort of comes out and we're just not like ourselves. We're very sort of in a sense of suffering. And there's two things that typically happen when we're triggered. There's the very fast thinking, blah 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 blah. Okay, the chatty mind is on another octave, if or you could say a higher gear, so it's moving a lot faster. Number two is there's a very uncomfortable feeling in our body, whether it's the chest or the stomach, depending where it is for different people. But overall, there's a negative emotion, a negative feeling in the body being very felt very distinctly. So when we start to look at how do we move out of a triggered state, okay, because we've looked at some other stuff, loving kindness, we've looked at thinking through, and those are all valid, but they're a little difficult to apply when we're in that sort of heightened triggered state and everything feels catastrophic and it's very difficult to start to think through anything. So there's two elements, like I said, the thoughts and the feeling. And the important principle to realize is that it is the thoughts are the food for the bad feeling. The thoughts are feeding the bad feeling in the body. And therefore, we don't want to wish the feeling away, but it is helpful to begin working on the catastrophic, super heightened, blah, 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 blah going on. So we can look at, so the food, the mind is feeding into the negative feeling. And that's really what's necessary to sustain that kind of triggered state. So, for example, and this is very hypothetical, if I was walking down the street and somebody looks at me and then spits in my face, okay, of course I'm going to have a very angry feeling, a very angered sort of outrage response in my body. And that's very normal. So we're not talking about that initial response when something can happen to us that's very unusual or very unkind or very mean. It can jump at us. But if I could be with that very sort of intense, let's say, anger, if someone just spat in my face, and I didn't think about it at all, I didn't think zero about what just occurred. I just completely felt my anger. The body cannot sustain it for more than 90 seconds or so. But what would perpetuate it, what would keep me angry, would be the fact that I think about this person who spat in my face and I would think about them again and again. And this would just keep me angry for, who knows how long. So when we're triggered and the mind is going really fast and we're feeling a lot of negative feelings in our body, it's important to start interrupting the story in our mind. Once again, when we talk about breathing, for example, so let's say someone's triggered or I'm triggered and it's like blah, 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 and I'm feeling this feeling. And I'm going to try to breathe. It's not working. I'm still stressed. Forget it. I'm just going to keep thinking about it. But it's on the right track when you begin to do this, because you want to cut off the food supply, which is the thoughts that are feeding the feeling. And when the feeling still is intense, it kind of loops back up and kind of encourages the thoughts to keep being catastrophic. So we want to cut off that sort of negative loop. So the real reality of it, and this podcast is not about giving easy recommendations. This podcast is about giving real recommendations in the reality of our inner world and how it interfaces with the outer world. So we're in a triggered state. It's going very fast. And so you want to take, like we talked about, breathing stillness, focus on your nostrils, focus on your belly, focus on the bad feeling. Just feel it fully and we just breathe. Blah, 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 blah. Then it's going to go again. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. And you keep interrupting the story you're telling yourself. If I go to it, this is another hypothetical way to explain this. If I go to a dinner party and there's 8 people there and we're all having a good discussion and I start to talk and I'm on a roll, I'm saying something, a really great story. It's funny. Everybody's listening to me. I've got everybody's attention and I'm talking and, I'm loving this attention from everybody. And then all of a sudden somebody comes, the person beside me looks at me and says, Guillaume, can I talk to you? I'm like, yeah, hold on. 1 second. I go back to my story. And then the person beside me again goes, yo, I got to talk to you. Let me talk to you. I'm like, yeah, hang on. And then I keep talking. And then the third and fourth time, this person keeps interrupting me. I'm like, yeah, hang on. And then I go back to my story and I kind of lose my flow. I lose my momentum, my train of thought. And then, everybody kind of starts not paying attention to me anymore and moves on to their own conversations. And I kind of lost the flow here. Well, that's what you want to do with your own story. Because when you're triggered and the emotion's intense and the mind is very busy and catastrophic, it is not a reliable tool anymore. The mind is they say, there's that saying, the mind is a cruel master, but a good servant. And when the mind gets like that and it's taking over, there's no point in listening to it anymore. It's not going to be helpful in guiding you in terms of your life. So you need to start interrupting the story. So blah, 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 blah. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. And then it starts to get a little more settled because you're cutting the momentum. You're cutting the momentum. And slowly it loses the intensity. The grip isn't quite as intense. And the hooks that keep getting you and pulling you back in aren't quite as round. They start to be a little more loose in terms of hooking you back in. And so, again, this is not about providing this easy way out of a triggered state. It's really tricky. And Lord knows, next time I get triggered, it's going to be challenging for me to apply this very recommendation and do it well. But it is a more efficient way out, because what we're talking about here is if you get pretty solidly triggered, can you move out of it in 1 to 2 hours rather than being in a grumpy, not great mood all day long for the next 2-3 days? This is about being real here. And how can we move out of this more efficiently? The other thing to realize is when we're in a triggered state and everything's catastrophic and the emotions are intense, it has momentum, it has energy. So we do have to have a certain patience with this process. Again, interrupt it, blah, blah, blah. Interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it. But if you take a train as another analogy, you take a freight train that's going 100 kilometers an hour and you cut the engine, it's not going to just stop. It needs to slowly lose its momentum. Okay. And once we start to bring the energy down, okay, so I'll say one more time, it's important to feel the negative feeling while you're breathing. This is not about feeling good in the moment. This is about cutting the momentum of the thinking. Interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it, interrupt it. In order to eventually return to a better state emotionally, more efficiently. But we ought not look for that immediate, instant, I feel better now. I took 2-3 breaths. I was triggered. Now I'm perfect. It's that's not how it works. We got to work through it, interrupt, 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 interrupt. And once the triggered state can come down a little bit, then we can start to look at the story. And we talked about, catching the thinking traps and trying to find a better thought and applying the loving kindness energy if it's somebody that frustrated us, or thinking through a situation, like if it's the bank statement and we don't know what we're going to do about money or whatever. We can start to use these other tools to keep polishing it off and keep working through it in terms of really letting it go. But when we're in that catastrophic triggered state and it's kind of like it's the end of the world in our head, it's really important to disregard, any reliability in terms of what's happening in our head and just start to interrupt it with the breathing, cut off the food supply that's feeding the negative emotion. And as it starts to settle a little more and more, you're sort of starving the negative emotion out. It won't have anything to feed on. And naturally, your emotional regulation system will begin to right itself correctly. Okay. So that's all we have for today, folks. But remember, a triggered state, when our mind is catastrophic, it is unreliable. Let's begin to interrupt that story again and again and again and again. I hope you have a good day, folks. We'll see you next time.